how would you describe yourself if somebody told you to write it on index cards? What types of things would you include? So you might include Black. You might say, I'm a woman or I'm a man. You might include things like a mother. You might include personality characteristics like, I'm caring or kind or sassy. What would you write? You can go ahead to the next slide. So all of the things that you would write on that index card are considered your identities. And we have many, many identities, and they often change as we develop. And they also change based on the environment we're in. So sometimes our identities are more salient or more important depending on our environment. When I go home and I have 3 kids and they all run up, that identity of mother becomes very present and important in that environment. And then maybe it fades a little bit more to the background when I'm, hanging out with friends on a grown-up trip. So we all have many identities. The question we want to ask is how MS plays a role in our identity. Next slide. So MS can be a part of our identity in varying ways. And there's no wrong way to integrate or include MS in your identity, but we can have both positive and negative ways that we engage our identity. So the first type of identity engagement with MS is what I call the backpack identity. And the backpack identity is sort of like when your MS is with you, but it's not really a part of your identity. It's not a part of the things that you would write down on that index card. And like I said, the backpack identity can be healthy or unhealthy. So when MS is has a healthy backpack identity, we have the things that we need in our backpack. When we need to take our backpack off and pull tools out or treatment or approaches, we do that. Our backpack has all of the things that we need in it. It's not neglected. We keep up with it. And that's a really healthy backpack identity with MS. But we can also have an unhealthy backpack identity. When we have an unhealthy backpack identity, it's kind of neglected. We don't really check what's in our backpack. We are reluctant to pull it off our back even when we need to. And so that is the backpack identity. Next slide. Some people engage MS from a distant relative identity. So I want you to think about the relatives that you don't really talk to. Maybe you're on friends with social media, but y'all don't really keep up. They come in town for the family reunion, okay? So maybe you see them once a year or once every other year. And that distant relative tends to be out of sight, out of mind until the next time you see them. So folks with an MS identity, that's like a distant relative, MS is only present when it's present. And with the distant relative identity, just like with the backpack identity, it can be healthy or unhealthy. So when it's healthy, when the distant relative comes in town, they're accepted, we engage them, we think about the things that they need, we spend time until they leave town again. But if you all have an idea of an unhealthy distant relative, and you have one of those relatives where when you see them coming, you're like, oh my God, I do not even want to go to the family reunion because I have to see this person. So when the distant relative comes into town, we're grieved about it. We don't want to engage. We want to ignore and avoid. This can be an unhealthy distant relative identity with MS. Next slide. The third type of way we might identify with MS is what we call the integrated identity. And this is an integrated identity is where MS becomes a part of my identity. It is one of the things that I write on that index card, and it becomes a part of the way I describe, one part of the way I describe who I am. And just like the backpack identity and distant relative identity, the integrated identity can be healthy or unhealthy. So with healthy integrated MS identities, we're engaged, we're connected, we're showing up to stuff like Black MS Experience Summit, we're connecting in MS community, we're connecting around advocacy, etc. But for folks who have an unhealthy integrated identity, MS becomes the sole part of who we are, and we begin to neglect other parts of our identity. So, maybe we're engaged around a lot of MS specific identity stuff, but we're not paying attention to the other important parts of who we are. Next slide. So no matter how you identify or how your MS identity develops, it's a process. And oftentimes at the beginning of that process, a common reaction to any new identity is grief. And grief is just a normative part of the human experience, and we often experience it anytime we have a change in identity, regardless of if it's connected to MS or motherhood, fatherhood, a change in, when we grow older, we move out of our parents' house. Grief is a normal part of that process. Next slide. So many people have heard of the stages of grief, and oftentimes engaging a new identity around MS comes with some stages of grief after diagnosis, and even sometimes before diagnosis. Some of us take a little bit longer to get our diagnosis and often can enter those stages of grief before diagnosis. But those stages include some denial, so just kind of wanting to avoid, not really believing, that this is happening. And then anger and frustration is a common stage of grief. So feeling frustrated, why is this happening to me? Recognizing that things might be different in some ways and feeling angry about that. Sometimes there's some bargaining, and oftentimes that bargaining can happen for past and future. So past bargaining looks like, what if I had done something different? Did I do something wrong? Did I expose myself to something? Did I eat the wrong things? And then future bargaining can sound like, what if I change my lifestyle or change things in a specific way? Can I reverse this? So future bargaining is not necessarily rooted in our health process, but it's rooted in wanting to turn back the hands of time, if you will. Depression is another stage of grief. And this is when we kind of feel overwhelmed and maybe a little bit hopeless and a little bit hostile about the situation. And then the final stage of grief tends to be acceptance. So when we really learn to live with our MS, what it means for us, and begin to feel positive about the future. Next slide. Now, the funny thing about the stages of grief is that we often talk about them in this linear line, but they don't often look like that, especially when it comes to stages of grief in MS and identity. So oftentimes the stages of grief look more like this slide, where I move forward in the stages and backwards and around. And the stages of grief are unique to every person. So every person's journey looks a little bit different. Some people move into an acceptance stage very early and don't hit a denial or anger or depression stage until later in diagnosis. There's no one way to grieve. You'll often find as well that as we move through different experiences in the MS experience, that the stages of grief may recur, so at relapse, for instance, or if there's a specific change in our bodies or in our engagement, if there's a specific change in even our routines around medication, treatment providers, these things can often trigger grief. Next slide. The beautiful news is, and the great news is, that we know from research that as time moves on, from the time point of diagnosis, that MS identity does become integrated into our sense of self. And over time, it becomes often a positive part of our self-identity in whatever, whether it's a backpack identity, a distant relative identity, or an integrated identity, it becomes a positive part. And that is often impacted by our seeking and receiving support. Next slide. So what does seeking and receiving support look like? It can look like a number of things. It can look like coming into these spaces, learning about new things, having discussions with others in the MS community. It can look like learning about resources and treatments and managing our symptoms that sometimes can move us through our grief journey and into a more positive self-identity. It can look like support groups, so sitting down with people who understand our experiences and talking through the things that we're going through. And it can look like individual counseling or family counseling to help our loved ones, caregivers, friends understand. And then mindfulness has been shown to be really effective with with MS. And mindfulness is really about getting into the here and now. So our present moment, learning how to center ourselves and to move out of our future anxiety or out of our past regrets and just really appreciate our present moment.